Today I'm going to talk about the Roman Republic. Now, the Roman Republic was made up of lots of different people that the Romans had conquered and allowed to become citizens. Many of them could get the right to vote, and as you had more and more citizens, they would challenge the landowners. Now, the Romans were divided into two social classes. You had the patricians. These were Rome's ruling class and wealthy landowners. Then the plebeians. These were the artisans, the shopkeepers, and the small farm owners of Rome. They're the majority of the Roman population. Both had the right to vote, had to pay taxes, and serve in the army. There was no marriage between these groups. Now, the patricians had a higher social status, while the plebeians, they couldn't even hold public office. Now, the government was made up of three sections so that one group could not get too much power. This is similar to the US government. The consuls made the first group. These were two top government officials, and they were elected. New ones were elected every year. This is to make sure that they did not abuse their power and have power too long. They headed the government and the army. The praetors acted as judges in the courts and helped explain the laws. The legislative, these were the lawmakers. This is a senate made up of 300 patrician men. They had a lifetime membership, and they would give advice to consuls. They made up the laws, debated and approved infrastructure programs, which meaning they would okay them. It was okay to build things or not. Now, there was a conflict between the plebeians and the patricians. Now, the plebeians were not happy about having very little power in the government. So what they did was they stopped serving in the army, and then they left the city to start their own republic. Now, this scared the patricians because then they would fear that they'd have less people to rule over and be part of their citizenry. So eventually they were allowed the plebeians to participate in the government and make decisions. Now, women were also allowed to get married between the groups, but they could not participate in government. Sometimes the Roman government would need a dictator, and they would sort of hire out a dictator whenever there was war. As soon as the danger was gone, the dictators gave up their power, which was very unusual considering what the dictator does today. Cincinnatus was a farmer. He was called up to be a dictator. He was a farmer that he was in the middle of his field, and they said, "Why don't you be our dictator?" And that's what he did. He led the army against the enemy, then went back to his farm. He didn't want to rule anymore. Then you had Roman law. Now, the Roman law was made up of 12 tables. Now, these 12 tables were laws that all the Romans had to follow. The reason they made their 12 tables was because the Romans came up with laws, the patricians came up with laws, and the plebeians said, well, you need to have these laws written down, otherwise you can just sort of make things up. So if you write down the laws, there's no misunderstanding or confusion. As Rome conquered more people, a new collection of laws were made called the Law of Nations. Laws were equal for everyone, even between citizens and non-citizens. Rome expansion involved conquering all of Italy and then beyond. They first now faced a new enemy called Carthage, and they were off the coast of North Africa. Carthage was developed by the patricians. It became a great trading empire and controlled the West Mediterranean trade routes and became very rich. During the first, now this was a bit of a threat for the Romans, and a war broke out called the First Punic War happened between Carthage and Rome, and they fought over Sicily. Carthage was a strong naval power, so the Romans the only way to defeat them is they had to build their own navy. And they did eventually build their own navy and defeat Carthage 20 years later. Now, the Second Punic War happened several years later, and this is where Carthage gained land in other areas, like in southern Spain. Well, Rome was not happy about this, so they decided to help out the people in Spain to rebel. Carthage was very upset about this, so they sent Hannibal, this is one of their finest generals, to send an army to attack. They used thousands of soldiers and elephants to do this, and they also crossed over the Alps on the way to Rome. There they defeated the Romans, but they had several other battles along the way. Eventually the Romans would win back. Lastly, there was a Third Punic War, and there are several final battles where Rome eventually wins, and Rome burns Carthage to the ground, and in the process enslaving 50,000 men, women, and children. Later on, they would defeat Macedonia and the city-states, and later rule over all of Greece and the Mediterranean Sea.